So when you talk about sodium above 15%. So when you're out there talking about the soils, I'll have people come in and say, well, I have this piece of alkali ground. Well, do they really mean alkali? Do they mean saline? What are they actually talking about when they're talking about that problem or marginal soil? It makes a difference out there as far as what we can do for you on providing an alfalfa variety. A lot of times the differences out there may be more than just saline. You have a water percolation problem. Your soil may be high in sodium, and when those soils are high in sodium, a lot of times you can get water to penetrate that soil. And salts tend to build up in those types of soils because you cannot reach the salt out of the soil profile because you have too much sodium in that soil. So again, a different problem beyond what we talked about as far as salinity. So we want sodium absorption ratio. Anything above 13 is a problem soil. So if you have a soil analysis out there, your SAR or sodium absorption ratio is above 13, that's a whole other issue. And you may have to do something else besides looking at the salt out there. You may have to look at trying to improve that soil and get rid of some of that sodium so that you can leach some of the salts out of the soil. Again, the saline soil is one that is defined as a soil that has enough salts in soil solutions to interfere with crop growth. In broad terms, an EC of greater than 4 is considered a saline soil. So if you go out in the field and you test that soil, send the soil sample back to a lab, and that EC is above 4, then you have a saline soil. Now we know that alfalfa is a little bit sensitive to the salts that are out there. Conventional alfalfa that hasn't been selected or improved for saline for its ability to tolerate saline soils. Conventional alfalfa, when alfalfa has an EC, the soil has an EC of around 2, that's the upper threshold for alfalfa. As we move to an EC above 2, we start losing yield out there in that field. So an EC of 3 loses about 7.5% yield. And so for each point above 2, we start losing yield in that field. So it's really important to know what your EC levels are in your soils, and that gives you an idea of how much problem you have to deal with in that environment. Now, in different parts of the country, we have different soil salts. Sometimes it's sodium sulfate, other times it's just plain sodium chloride, like table salt. But different parts of the country, different types of salts that we're dealing with. But at the end of the day, we're talking about the total salts in that soil and how that affects the plant. So, different parts of the country, different types of saline problems. In the Southwest, when I first started looking at developing salt-on varieties, we were looking at dry environments where the salts were, the soil was drying up from the high heat of the day, and the salts were being deposited on top of the soil. Or also in irrigated land. We know that anytime you irrigate alfalfa in other parts of the country, the saline seeps is the issue, where there's already salts in the soil profile, but the water table is bringing the salts up to the surface. So here's a map of the U.S. showing the extent of salinity across the U.S. You can see that pretty much it's a western problem. In the Dakota, Montana area, we have a lot of salts. A lot of that's saline seeps, where there's salts in soil, and the water tables are bringing those salts to the surface. In the arid Southwest, again, that's evaporation, bringing salts to the top of the soil from irrigation that's evaporating and salts depositing there. A lot of times, like I mentioned, our irrigation water that we use has salts in it. Here's a river outside of Torrington, New Mexico. You can see a fair amount of salt being deposited in the sand right there by the river. Again, the quality of water can vary depending on the river and how close it is to the snowpack and where that water is flowing. So there's a lot of water out there that can be used for irrigation, but the content of salt can vary. We know that anywhere that there's irrigation, there is alfalfa, there is salt being deposited on that alfalfa. We know that different water has different amounts of salt. We can say that good quality water, the total dissolved salt's less than 300 milligrams per liter, or an EC of, let's say, 0.5. That's pretty good water. Anything that's above total dissolved salts greater than 300 to 800 milligrams per liter. That's poor quality water. So if you went on that river and tested the water, you can get varying levels depending on where you are in that stream. Maybe Northern California, they had good water. By the time you got to Southern California or Mexico, it's picked up a lot of salts over time down through the state. So an EC above 0.5 to 1.2, again, that's poor quality water as far as measured by EC. When I saw this quote a few years back, it was really quite interesting on how much salt is out there and how much is being deposited in the fields from our irrigation. California Aqueduct, which is the main irrigation supply of the farmers in California, it deposits 600 to 700 pounds of salt per acre foot of water supply. So if you look at a field that you're putting 4 acre feet on in a season, you're depositing 1.2 tons of salt per acre per year. So you really have to come up with an idea of having to deal with that salt out there, because every time you irrigate, you're depositing some salts out there, and you need to be able to either flush that salt out of the soil profile or somehow deal with those salts. Here's a field where they were using drip lines. You can see the salts starting to accumulate right there in the evaporation from the water on that soil profile. Here's another field in California that I looked at a couple of years ago. Again, salts building up in certain parts of the field. Again, it can be a significant issue over time if you don't have some way of dealing with that. The other thing to think about is that also anytime you're putting manure out in the field, cattle manure has salt in it, and so over time, if you're putting a lot of manure out there, you also contribute to the salt level in that field. In other parts of the country, the saline seeps are an issue. Like I said, the water table bringing salts up to the surface. So in a wet year, where the water table is coming up, you probably more and more salts. And again, reducing the amount of farmable acres that you have on that farm. So again, different areas of the country, different issues, and how that salt is being deposited. Now, when I first got involved in looking at salinity, talked to a soils person. They used one type of measurement. We talked to a water person. They were using another type of measurement. But anyway, on this chart here, it's a conversion chart. On this left-hand side, you can see a percent salt. Seawater is about 3% salt. If you look at, say, half the concentration of seawater, 1.5%, an EC of about 23.3. So different people use different ways of measuring the salts. The majority of what I'll talk about today is EC, or sometimes they call it decisiemens per liter. But again, EC is one way of measuring the amount of salts that you have in your soil or your irrigation water. Now you can take a soil sample out in the field, send that into the lab, and they'll give you a measurement. But the other thing that we've been looking at the last few years in our program is a portable EC meter. I have one up here on the table. You can look at that. It's a really quick way of measuring the salt in your soils out in the field. You can take a soil sample, put that soil in a bucket, have some distilled water with you, add a little bit of water to that until you get sort of a shiny paste, and then just stick this probe right into it, hit the button, and it comes up with an immediate EC number for you. And so you can go all different parts of the field just taking samples one after another and get a feel for what the salinity is in your field in a quick manner, and give you a really good idea of what you're dealing with and trying to farm that piece of ground. You have a moderate level of salt, or you have parts of the field that are higher in salts that you're going to have to deal with. So, when we talk about alfalfa, as an alfalfa breeder, we look at the genetics of trying to improve alfalfa for whatever its tolerance was originally. But there's different crops out there that have different thresholds for salinity. Here's a chart that shows the relative salt tolerance of different agricultural crops. Here on top you can see a 0, 10%, 25%, and 50%. That's the reduction of yield based on what level of EC. Now, when they're out there talking about EC, the scientists will say ECE, that's what it's in the soil. EC ECW is what EC that they're looking at in water. And so the different tolerances for whether it's in the soil extract or the just irrigation water. So we know that alfalfa, we have no reduction in yield at an EC of 2 in the soil. It takes about 1.3 EC of water to give us 0 reduction. But when we start going up into EC, we get a 10% yield reduction if our soil tests at EC 3.4, EC water 2.2, a 10% reduction, and so on. As the EC increases, we get more and more yield reduction. You can see barley, no reduction at 8 EC, but at 10%, 10 EC, you're losing 10%. So different crops, different levels of tolerance out there. And we've known for years that some crops will tolerate salts better than others. So, like I said, ECE is in soil extract, electrical conductivity of the saturation soil extract, and the ECW is the water. Now, I think Ron passed out this management guide. We've done so much work in the last few years on salinity. We decided to write all that down and give you a management guide on mainly in relation to alfalfa. It has all those charts, different crops, their tolerances. EC explains that. It's a really good reference sheet. I advise you to find it out and read it if you're having to deal with salinity on your farm. It'll give you lots of good information, and a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about today is covered in there. So in addition to salt in the soils, sometimes we can improve the species of the crop to use, but other times the salinity is bad enough that you need to look at more than just genetics. You need to have maybe soil amendments to improve the soil structure. If you've got a lot of sodium out there, you have to do something to address the sodium problem. Again, take a sample, get it to a soil lab, and they can give you some recommendations on what they can do as far as soil amendments to correct some of the problems that are out there. Now we know that some of the soil amendments, like on sodic soils, you won't have the water penetration or soil structure, and the water just doesn't penetrate into that soil. You can put gypsum out there that provides calcium in these high pH soils. Sulfurs or acids can lower the pH to create some calcium in these sodic soils. Manure organic matter also helps in the soil structure. Again, what we're trying to do is improve the soil structure where you can leach some of these salts out of that soil profile that's accumulating from either from irrigation or the problems that the salts that are building up in that soil. So remediation of the saline soils, you can look at crop rotation. Maybe use a crop that's a little more species that's more tolerant to salt. Get something growing out there on that field, improve that soil, and then eventually move into a higher value crop, a better species that gives you more value for that acres out there. So different ways of looking at salinity out there and trying to address that problem. As an alfalfa breeder, a number of years ago, we decided, well, can we improve alfalfa? We'll make it a little bit more tolerant to the salts that are out there. Can we push that envelope, making it a little bit more tolerant to the salinities that are out there just from the genetic aspect? And so the salinity effect on alfalfa plant growth, we want to look at how much salt does it take to affect alfalfa when it's germinating? How much salt does it take to have a negative effect when the plant's starting to grow after it's germinated? And we found that on germination, an EC of less than 1, we really don't have an issue as far as alfalfa germinating. But when alfalfa is exposed to salinity, say it's EC of 1 to 2, we have about 5 to 10% of the seeds that you put out on that ground that are going to die. And as the salinity increases, or EC levels increases, we get more and more of those seeds dying out there in that saline environment. And so what we wanted to do is, can we, from an alfalfa breeding aspect, push that tolerance to a higher level? Because we know that we're getting these hot spots out there where alfalfa is not germinating, and we're not getting the stand that we want in some of these environments. Then after we could improve alfalfa for its germination, we also wanted to look at mature plant. How much can we improve it for its tolerance to that salinity that's out in the field? We know that conventional alfalfa, anything above an EC2, we're losing yield. Like I mentioned earlier, 10% yield loss of an EC 3.4. Can we push our alfalfa genetics to tolerate a higher level before we start seeing these yield losses? So in a breeding program, the first objective was, can we get the alfalfa seed to germinate out there in that field that has some higher saline problems? After it germinates, can we develop an alfalfa that will still provide a lot of forage tonnage, forage production in the presence of salinity, the plant starting to grow and past germination. And we want to reduce yield loss with salinity, that's the overall objective. But we also want to maintain yields on non-saline soils. We want to have an alfalfa variety that can be used on the whole farm, not just on the saline part of the farm. We want to have that insurance policy built into that top-of-the-line variety that can have really good production on that non-saline soils, but also have that insurance package that when it does encounter part of the field that has some salt problems, it still provides a good forage production. So on the breeding end, this is how we looked at breeding for improved germination. You can see that one of these Petri plates, we have some alfalfa seed in that. We irrigated that with a pretty high level of EC 20, almost half the concentration of seawater. And we can see that the majority of the seeds didn't germinate. But alfalfa has a lot of genetic variability, and there were a few seeds that even in those high levels of salt did germinate. So we rescued those, put those into a pot, planted them up, and let it grow, and then we produced seed off those plants that did germinate in that level of EC. Then we produced seed off those plants, and then repeated the process all over again, generation after generation. And eventually we went from an alfalfa variety that looked like this at EC 20 to one that germinated like this at EC 20. So we were genetically being able to modify the alfalfa and had a lot more tolerance for the salinity at the germination stage. So after we accomplished that, the next step was, well, we got to germinate, but we also want, at the end of the day, we want hay production. And so we wanted to look at plants after they germinated. So we planted hundreds of thousands of plants in these containers, and then we started irrigating them with salt water. And we killed a lot of plants. We kept increasing the salt level. We killed a lot of plants, but there were some that were surviving. You can see even on the top of these containers, you can see salt here, but that plant's still surviving. So an alfalfa breeder tries to kill lots of plants and take the ones that survive and use those as breeding material and moves on. So we were able to get plants that survive after germination, and could tolerate some of these levels of salts, and pushing that envelope even higher and higher over time. And so we started looking at the salinity tolerance of conventional plant breeding, non-GMO. We wanted to do this with conventional plant breeding. So we wanted to have varieties that have germination tolerance and also mature plant tolerance. And once we did that in our greenhouses, we went to the U.S. Salinity Lab in California. There's also a comparable one up in Canada. They had very sophisticated means of measuring the salinity effect on alfalfa plants. They had these huge columns of soil, and they could irrigate those columns of soil numerous times a day. They had drains on the bottom. They irrigate these columns of soil that we planted alfalfa in with different levels of salt, and we could start looking at the forage production of those different alfalfa lines that we were developing, experimental lines, and how they were performing under low, medium, and high levels of salt and out there in that really controlled condition. We used that looking at, say we had 15 or 20 experimental lines, the ones that seemed to have the most promise in some of these more advanced testing. Then we took those to the field. Here's in North Dakota, they had a salinity trial. We participated in that trial, put them out in the real world in hay production situations on ground that has some saline problems. We got some data back from that and identified which lines were going to perform in the real world as far as performance against salinity. We also, that was North Dakota. We also were doing trials in California. We had these alfalfa trials that we had borders around them. We irrigated those fields with salt, and you see the salt start to accumulate on top of the berms here. But again, we have alfalfa lines that are tolerating some of that salt, and we can identify which ones are going to be the best to finally release. Now, essentially what we've done on the breeding end is taken conventional alfalfa. Here's the salinity index. The bigger the number, the more salt tolerance it has. So down here at the bottom, we have alfalfa. That's what it was before we started, as far as its tolerance to salinity. So now, with our breeding that we've done over the last 8 to 9 years, we've pushed that alfalfa where it's a lot more tolerant than what conventional alfalfa was in the past. So now we're comparable to what barley is as far as tolerance to salt out in the field. So we've come from 6.7 to 8.2 on this salinity index. Again, pushing that envelope for that alfalfa to our salt. We also have some other species that we've been working with. There's a tall version of tall wheatgrass, a selection out of our Turkey. Really has some really good salt tolerance. So another species to look at as far as salinity out there in some of these tough environments. So what we've done is try to give you an alfalfa variety that will perform in these types of situations. In the past, you would take your conventional alfalfa and plant it out in the field that had some saline problems. You wouldn't get germination in part of that field. Right here is a salt, what I call a salt hot spot. You had alfalfa that didn't germinate. Maybe the salt in this back part of the field is not as bad. We got it to germinate. But to the farmer, that back part of the field looks okay. But what if that's an EC of a 3 or an EC4 back there in the back? He's losing yield, and it's not quite as obvious. And so what we've done is get you an alfalfa now that will germinate better in this hot spot, but also perform back here where you have a less obvious reduction in yield. So we actually, once we release these varieties, here's a farmer in North Dakota, near Bismarck. He had a field that he said all he was getting off, he really wasn't having any production off this field in the past, he was just paying taxes on that piece of ground. He tried one of our varieties called PGI 427. He got a stand out there, he got not a perfect field, but he was able to have a field that he was getting hay production off of. Really happy with it. Now he's getting revenue off that field instead of just paying taxes on that field. Here's another example of what we actually... Yes, sir.
Maybe down, but on that slide just before that, North Dakota. Yeah, I've noticed, when you plant the alfalfa, we do, ours is dry and on the bottom. You've always got along the tree line that doesn't want to grow, doesn't come up there. But I've noticed in years that there's dips and swerves that come in further into the ground. Is that something that could actually be the salinity in it instead of just, I always chalked it up as the roots were taking more moisture out right there.
Well, I think when we look at salinity, I think there's also a similar effect on drought. And so as we move forward in our breeding program, because it all comes down to the plant being able to pull moisture out of the soil. The salinity creates an osmotic where the plant has a hard time pulling water out of the soil. Whether or not it's drought, not as much water out there, or there's salinity. An EC meter will tell you really quick whether you've got a salt problem in that area of the field or the edge of the field. We've been using that portable EC meter a lot. We've given it to seed distributors or seed retailers. They use this, they go out to the farmer's field and test that part of the field and say, well, this is the level of salt you have. This is what you probably have or you probably don't have as far as salinity. So different parts of the field can have different levels of salinity. So this picture that you're seeing here right now is a pretty good example. A lot of times I see parts of the field the salts are higher, other parts of the field not as much salt. And you may get a stand in part of the field and maybe not in the other. So from the alfalfa genetics, we're doing something that has a little bit more tolerance that can be used in a lot part of this.
So did you say that the more salt tolerant alfalfa is, the more drought resistant it is?
It's somewhat related. We're going to look at it on the breeding end as we move forward. I think a number of years ago I was looking at drought tolerance. We were selecting plants that were drought tolerant. we were selecting a separate set of plants that were salt tolerant. And we found that if you took the salt tolerant material and put it under drought stress, they did fairly well. The drought material also did a little bit better under salt stress. So now, I think the two traits are somewhat related. It comes down to the ability of the plant to pull moisture out of the soil, and whether it's salt or drought. So I think as we move forward, we are seeing some positive data out there. We've had these varieties out long enough where this was that North Dakota site. We were comparing to, say, the public variety Vernal. But again, we were under these saline soils. We were still getting a lot better yield. We had two varieties, PGI 4.7 and Varieties. And both of those were giving us a significant advantage out there in the field because they had some salt tolerance. Here's a field of Cisco 2, another alfalfa variety we have that we use in New Mexico. It's in Tolerant 6. We had a dairyman there that was having issues with a piece of ground that he was trying to farm right next to the dairy. Really couldn't get a good stand. Cisco 2 really got a good stand. And so, again, some of these products out there we're farming and we're getting some real advantages. So, when we talk about maximizing the profit on saline soils and these new saline tolerant varieties, we want to have varieties that will germinate under these higher levels of salt. There are extremes that we can't. There are limits to what we can do. But we also want to make sure that that variety is a top-of-the-line variety. We just don't want you to buy a salt-tolerant variety and just put it on the worst piece of ground that you have. It's a better variety than that. There's a common misconception out there that you have an alfalfa variety that's salt-tolerant. You only put it on the worst ground. We wanted to provide you with a variety that can be used on the whole farm. But it just has that insurance package or that additional trait that has salt tolerance. It's a top-of-the-line variety. If you put it in a field that doesn't have salt, it's still going to be one of the best varieties out there. If you have parts of that field that has some saline problems, again, it's going to be able to overcome that better than what we've had in the past. These are the varieties that we currently have on the market. We have some from the Forage side, the regular PGI 427. And the newest material, AFX 457, the Magnum salt, we have for the Dairyland side, and didn't get it on this slide, but Hydroforce 2400 also has some salt tolerance. So Cisco 2, and then we also have a grass that we've been marketing AC salt under that has a whole other level of salt tolerance that you can, if you have some really, really tough ground. The other thing I want to mention is that alfalfa management for low to high salt levels. You need to conduct a soil and water test to determine what the problem is, how much salt do you have out there. Is it really salty or is it moderate salty? Also, you need to know what the pH is. I'll have farmers come to me and say, well, I've got this alkali piece of ground or this saline ground. They might think it's salt, but it might be also a pH issue. So when you get above an 8.4 on pH, my alfalfa genetics won't do you any good. Alfalfa's top level on pH is 8.4. So if you have a piece of ground that you may have some salt in it, but if it has a high pH problem, you're going to have to do something with soil amendments, a sulfur-based fertilizer or an acid-based fertilizer, something to bring that pH down to alfalfa likes a 6.5 to 7.5 pH. You can tolerate from 6 to an 8.4. So if you get below 6, we have issues. Above 8.4, we also have issues. So be aware you need to test the pH of what we're dealing with. Also, if there's a sodium issue, the sodium absorption ratio or the SAR, we need to be below 13 for my alfalfa genetic to be any good. If you have an EC that tests in range 4 to 8, we can do you some good with our alfalfa genetics. Get much above the EC of 8, maybe we want to start looking at the AC saltlander or one of the other species in that most extreme saline environment. So we can do so much with alfalfa on these improved salt tolerant lines, but again, there are limits to what we can do. Here's where people out in the field testing those hot spots with that EC meter. If you'd like to see that, we'll drop by here later on. I've got some soil samples, one that I'll test around the EC5 and one that tests below EC1. And really a neat machine getting out there and doing multiple tests out in the field. So again, stressing the point, saline soils can vary as to pH, and salt salinity tolerance is independent of pH tolerance. We're working on bringing in and trying to improve the pH tolerance of alfalfa, but it's a little bit more difficult than what we found on the salinity. Again, soil limits, if you get above 8.4, you're going to have to do something on soil limits, so just try to correct that. Planting considerations for saline tolerant varieties. You need to have realistic expectations. If you have a piece of ground that absolutely nothing is growing on, I probably can't do you good in the alfalfa. But there are alfalfa fields that we can give you improvement. If we have some salinity out there, we keep pushing that envelope and giving you more production. And also those hot spots out there, you've lost production off that part of the field. If we can get alfalfa to germinate in those hot spots, you get reclaim more of that piece of ground, and you get more total production off that piece of ground that you have. So you need to look at an integrated approach to salinity. The genetics is one aspect, but also the other aspects of water and soil management. So seeding rates, when you're out there and you're trying to overcome some of the salinity, you need to plant on high end or recommended rates either for irrigated or dry land. Take our salt tolerant variety, plant a little bit higher rate, all these types of saline soils. And in some situations, maybe a seed mixture of our alfalfa and SAC saltlander, or we have some other grasses that you can put in that environment out there that we've seen some success with that also. Planting considerations, planting time, moisture, crusting. Again, there may be some of the soils that's hard to get on in the spring because it's too wet. We have even looked at dormant planting in the winter months on some of these really tight pieces of ground to get on. And crusting, you've got a lot of crusting out there in the heat of the summer. It's probably not the time to be out there trying to plant and get something established. So either late fall or early spring, you get on in the spring. Again, you want to avoid that heat and the crusting in the spring out in the field. Planting considerations, seed placement adapt. You need to get that seed placed in the right place where you have good seed soil contact and you don't have some crusting issues. Planting considerations, check the soil fertility, make sure that the soils don't have any other issues out there besides the salinity. Healthy plants tolerate more plant stress and more stress with salt. And in summary, salinity grows an integrated approach. So we're providing you with the genetics of improved alfalfa line that will tolerate higher levels of salinity. But a lot of times you also have to look at soil and water management out there in that field. So improved saline tolerant varieties will reduce the size of these hot spots out in the field, more productive acres on the farm. Salinity tolerant varieties are also top yielders in non-saline fields. So we want to really stress that when we release these varieties, we want to make sure they're still top of the line varieties that add all the bells and whistles that you need in an alfalfa variety to improve that one trait out there for the salinity. I want to mention one other thing that we've been working on for the last few years with some of the Montana Soil Conservation District. They're managing saline seeps. They look at a long-term approach. If you're in an area where there's saline seeps, we're using alfalfa as a means of reducing the water table. And so what we do is, see in the back of this picture, there's alfalfa. That's the recharge area that's providing when water, when that field gets wet in the back, a lot of the water goes through that soil profile and hits the water table. The water table comes up and brings salts with it. And so we're using alfalfa with this deep tap run system to interrupt that recharge area and pull out some of that water before it gets to the water table. So essentially, the alfalfa is sucking the water out before it gets to the water table, and that's a means of reducing that water table and keeping the salts from coming to the surface from those saline seeds. We're using alfalfa in the back here on that recharge area, and we're using like AC saltlander closer to where the saline seed is and where the salt is in the iron. So an integrated approach being used in Montana and Dakota and also in Colorado. So anywhere there's saline seed, that's one way to look at a long-term solution for reducing that water table and preventing the salts from coming to the surface. So, I guess that's information in your packet. There's some rewards inside that registration packet to prove that. Be sure if you haven't already got one of the salt management guides, get one of those. If you have any other questions, you can go up here and look at the EC reader if you want to look at that, and they can give you a little demonstration of how to test your salts in the soil. It's a really neat machine that really helps us identify the extent of the problem. Yes, sir.
So have we looked, how much have you been able to impact pH with this sulfur activity?
You know, sulfur, it will affect the pH, it will bring it down. Sulfur, when it starts to dissolve in the soil, will run the sulfuric acid. Also, some of these sulfur-based fertilizers will help that. Also, some people use the acid-based fertilizers. Some use a liquid fertilizer. Anytime you can bring that pH down below 8.5, top level on alfalfa is 8.4. Start getting above that, my salt provided contributions. That's all we're doing.
What amount of sulfur, like, have you experimented any on pH with sulfur?
Yeah, you get into soil labs, they can tell you, based on the soil analysis, how much fertilizer, how much sulfur is it taking, or what type of fertilizer. So get with soil labs and they can give you a better idea of what you're dealing with and how to approach that pH problem. Now, alfalfa grader, we try to look at the salt problem and give you, push that in while there. The pH, we're looking at that on the breeding end, that's a little bit more difficult because not only have to deal with the alfalfa, but the beneficial rhizobium that produces nitrogen on the alfalfa root, it doesn't like the high pH of the low pH either. So we've got two problems. So the alfalfa produces nitrogen. So we're looking at pH. If we can just bring the pH from the tolerance from an 8.4 to say an 5 or 8.6, that would help us a lot in some of the soil. But I'll have farmers come in and they say, well, I've got this bad piece of ground, so I've got the salt on variety that's gone from an 8.6. One study will see that you've got to deal with pH problem. Any other questions? Okay, well, here's the EC meter. It has a sensor right on the end. You hit the button, turns it on. You stick that probe into the soil, or you put it in the irrigation water, and it comes up and immediately gives you an EC meter. All we do is go out in the field, bucket out there, soil probe, take a sample out of the soil, several spots, put it in a bucket, and a little bit of distilled water. You want to use distilled water because tap water has a little bit of salt in it. Distilled water doesn't have any salt in it. Add that until you get sort of a shiny paste. Just enough where you can stick that probe into it, and you've got it immediately. You can go all over the field in just a matter of minutes. So, if you've already irrigated the field, you can stick right into the soil. We've had farmers come and go, let's go and test my irrigation water. The bucket was water, puts us in, and we see the soil. It really was giving us a fast way. The past we had to take soil samples, send them to the lab, $20 or $30 for each sample. This one you can go out and you can test all over that field. So on that in your packet there, if you'd like somebody to come out and test your field, you can, on that packet it tells you how to contact one of our people and we'll come out and test your field. Yes, sir.
Thanks.
We initially bought one to try it out, and we bought several different EC meters. This one works the best. It's about $350 to $400. We bought 40 of them and gave them to our dealers across the country. And in areas that had salt pumps, and then I ordered another 10 last week. And it's been a little bit too. So it's simple. You put it in that wet soil, take your reading, and you just take a wet rag and wipe it off, put it back in place. Yeah, Yeah, we've got a chart in there, and the same one I showed up there, and also other ones, there were some charts in there that says the different grass species, barley, wheat, corn, what their tolerance levels are. Also the ECs, there's listed for the water and the soil. ECE would be the soil, ECW. If we were testing water, we would look at ECW and see what the tolerance was for alfalfa or farm. All in that. Spent a lot of time working on salinity, and we decided I would that a couple years ago. It's a good thing. Alfalfa really have to be, when I got out of college, I learned about insects and diseases in my alfalfa project. So then over time, I started looking at salinity and anything that limits production. Yes, sir.
You had the salt liver variety grass there. Is that pretty palatable?
Yeah, we actually, it was developed up in Canada. Initially, it was the U.S. government, USDA and Canada were looking at this. It was an introduction out of Turkey. And they were working on this project together, and then eventually USDA decided to drop it. Canadians kept with it. And so I was doing all this work on alfalfa, and I heard about this grass up in Canada, so we went up there and looked at it. And you get something that's salt tolerant, but really haven't seen it.
Yeah, exactly.
And so they actually had some beef cattle, some grazing trials, and they were gaining over 2 pounds per day. And this salt animal was about that tall. It was, they were grazing right on the ground. So it's palatable and good quality for you.
What about moisture requirement now? Ground water.
We actually have some management guide on it also. When it takes about 15 inches annually. So that grass. And a little bit more water, more production, but a minimum of 15 inches.
How's it stand hold up?
It dries on us, slow the first year. And then after that, it starts spreading out, and it's pretty good.
What kind of soil is it? Like baby soil?
We've had it in a lot of different environments. The main things is marginal soils with the salinity. It'll take a lot more salt than our alfalfa will. And so we've even had pieces of our alfalfa on this and planted out. And if it's really tough on that part of the ground, salt ladder works, and then as you go across the field, maybe the alfalfa will start to take over our salt on alfalfa.
Yeah, for replanting it every several years?
No, the AC salt ladder, it'll stay out there for a number of years. Like I said, it spreads, it has rhizomes and which it's pretty durable grass. We're excited about it.
You think it survives the drought situation in the quarter?
If you've got around 15 inches annually, get established this
Some years it rains 25, and some years it rains 9.
Well, I think once you've got it established, it probably tolerates some. Our rule of thumb is we need about 12, 15 inches. Yes.
How invasive is it? The salt in there, how invasive is it?
Really haven't seen an issue where it's been invasive. I think there's crack grasses out there that are salt tolerant you have to worry about. The salt lander will spread out with nothing compared to like crack grass. They call it, it's actually a new species of tall wheatgrass, they call it green wheatgrass, where you identify it.
This salt layer they call wheatgrass.
Well, originally it was a plant introduction out of Turkey, and they thought it was going to be just a version of tall wheatgrass, but they did some more genetic work on it. They figured it was a different species, and so the official, it's a green wheatgrass. And the reason they called it green was it was under dry land conditions, it was staying greener longer than some of the other wheatgrasses, because it was more drought tolerant than some of the others.
It was more ground cover than some of the other wheatgrass.
That's why they call it green wheatgrass.
I thought the wheatgrass was pretty ground tolerant.
No, grass was a little more than it was.
So they plant a lot of what's it called, crested wheatgrass, right? How does this compare to that? Is it related to
I
that?
think there's no, not related to crested wheatgrass. We were doing a mix of it, initially we were doing spinach wheatgrass, AC saltlander, and fescue. And fescue with salt on it. And we were doing like 50% saltlander and 25% spinach wheatgrass, and then 25% fescue. And using that as a mix, and there's a lot of different environments. And spinach wheatgrass gives a lot more production than fescue that year. The saltlander was a little slow, and then by the second year, the saltlander started coming on strong.
That's what we provide.
Now we offer it just pure, so AC saltlander. In the first 3 years, we were looking at it. Up in Canada, they were using the spinach wheatgrass and fescue.
So on an annual production, on a tonnage basis per acre, does it compare with alfalfa and the environment?
Well, like I said, it didn't get that tall, but
It's fairly thick.
yeah, like once it's established, it would do very well. Quality-wise, alfalfa is still outdoing quality. It's still- It's palatable.
Yeah, grow what you can grow.
Right. Yeah, and some of the larger grounds, that may be, they say they see that, not getting anything else to go off there, except cocoa.
Have you experienced with Bermuda grass on the soil?
Yeah.
How does this salt in compare to Bermuda grass? We've had some pretty good success growing the Bermuda grass on the alkali, doesn't grow hardly anything. So, I was just curious what your feelings were.
There's a chart here, there's a tab here, which is all.
We were looking at the same pictures.
There's let's see. I have another chart because of the bluegrass. AC salt is a lot higher than the bluegrass trees. The bluegrass is pretty salt on, so AC salt. But that is a lot of heat. So we use bluegrass down in the south.
It is, yeah, it won't take the
AC salt
dry
and
wood.
AC salt is cool season grass.
Yeah, cool. So it's a lot like that to you. I mean, it come on in the spring early and then kind of dormant in the summer and then come on in the fall.
Well, it's cool season grass, so it has extreme heat, so. But in some situations, that may be the only thing we get production off on that piece of ground. So. Anything else? Well, you got my name. If you ever have any questions, you can send me an email, don.miller@alfalfa.com. Don.miller.
I expect you guys